The Willow Ridge Country Club shimmered with golden lights and soft piano music on that cool September evening. The ballroom was dressed in deep red and ivory, a reflection of the occasion, Helen and Richard Whitmore's 40th wedding anniversary. Guests in tailored suits and elegant gowns clinked champagne glasses and shared stories of admiration for the seemingly timeless couple. Helen, graceful in a navy blue gown with delicate lace sleeves, moved through the crowd with practiced elegance. Her pearl necklace caught the chandelier's light as she smiled at well-wishers. Richard, tall and silver-haired, stood confidently by the stage, a champagne fluid in hand, waiting for the perfect moment to command the room. When it came time for speeches, the crowd quieted. Helen took Richard's arm and followed him to the front. Their steps synchronized like they'd done this for decades. The guests applauded politely, raising glasses for a toast. Richard tapped the microphone and cleared his throat. His voice, smooth and measured, carried easily across the room. 40 years, he began, his eyes scanning the faces of friends, family, and community leaders. 40 years is a long time to share your life with someone. It gives you perspective, it gives you clarity. He turned to Helen and smiled, but it wasn't warm. And tonight, I think it's time to be honest. The room tensed. I never loved you, Helen. Not a day in those 40 years. You were just convenient. Gas rippled across the crowd. A fork clattered to the floor. Someone coughed in disbelief. At the front table, Helen's sister, Eleanor, dropped her glass. It shattered against the marble, the sound as sharp as the words just spoken. Helen's face froze. Her eyes didn't blink. Her lips trembled as if her entire system had short-circuited. But within seconds, she drew a deep breath, lifting her chin slightly. The room fell into a thick silence. All eyes locked on Helen, waiting to see if she would cry, scream, or flee. Instead, she took a small step forward and reached for the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but there was a current of steel beneath it. Convenient, she echoed, meeting Richard's eyes. And then she smiled. A smile not of grace, but of something deeper. Something final. If we're speaking honestly tonight, then I have a few truths of my own. Helen's hand never wavered as she held the microphone, though her heart pounded like a drum. The silence in the room was complete. So complete, in fact, that even the ice in the champagne bucket seemed to stop crackling. You think I was convenient? She said, her eyes fixed on Richard. Maybe I was, but you were too. Just not in the way you imagined. A few guests exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered something inaudible, quickly silenced by a spouse's elbow. Helen's voice steadied. When we got married, Richard I was already pregnant. A collective gasp swept the room like a wave crashing over a brittle shore. Richard's smug expression flickered, then dropped completely. Helen continued, her tone calm but cutting. I was 21, young, scared, and in love with someone else. His name was David Carter. He worked at my father's manufacturing plant. He was kind, brilliant, and he made me feel seen. She paused, scanning the room, then glanced briefly at Eleanor, who was staring at her lap, motionless. David and I had plans. We were going to leave town, start fresh, build a life together. But 2 weeks before the wedding, he was gone. A car hit him late one night. No one ever found the driver. She exhaled, her voice trembling slightly, but she held firm. My parents couldn't handle the scandal of their unwed daughter raising a child alone. And you? She turned to Richard again. You were facing pressure to marry before your 25th birthday to secure your inheritance. You saw an opportunity. So did they. The crowd sat stunned. Even the server stood still, their trace frozen mid-air. What no one knew, Helen said, was that our marriage was never built on love. It was built on desperation, image, and family expectations. And while you may have thought you were doing me a favor, I knew exactly what I was walking into. Eleanor suddenly shifted as if trying to vanish into her seat. Helen noticed, but pressed on. You see, I agreed to marry you, not because I wanted your name or your money. I agreed because I needed protection for me and for my child. She looked into the audience, her voice growing stronger. But what I didn't know was just how dark that protection would become, or how deep the betrayal truly went. A quiet sob broke through the tension. All heads turned to the front table where Eleanor, Helen's sister, sat pale and trembling, her hands covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. A moment later, she dropped her face into her hands. Helen looked at her with gentle sorrow. "It's okay, Eleanor," she said softly. "You've carried this long enough." Eleanor shook her head as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you years ago. I should have told everyone." Helen nodded and then turned back to the crowd. The night David died, Eleanor saw it happen. Murmurs swept across the room like a sudden gust of wind. "She wasn't just nearby," Helen said. "She was walking home from work, taking the shortcut through the alley by the back lot of the factory." Eleanor lifted her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the car coming. It wasn't speeding until it got close." David turned around at the last second. He tried to jump away. She paused, shaking violently. But the car, it swerved toward him, hit him full force. A gasp escaped from one of the guests. Another muttered, "Oh my God." Eleanor closed her eyes. I ran to him, but it was too late. He was already gone. I looked up and I saw the driver. It was Richard. All eyes swung toward Richard. He stood frozen, his skin the color of chalk. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in years, the mask of charm was gone. Helen stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her voice now firm and unwavering. I didn't find out the truth until much later. Eleanor stayed silent because she was afraid. We all were. Richard had power, influence, and after I married him, he used that power to keep us quiet, to keep me obedient. He erased David's name from my life and replaced it with his own. The guests sat frozen as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others stared down at their hands, ashamed to have once admired the man now standing exposed. "And tonight," Helen said, her eyes fixed on Richard. "That silence ends." Richard finally spoke, his voice low and ragged. "You can't prove any of this. It's your word against mine." But Helen didn't flinch. "You still think this is about you winning or losing, don't you?" She said, "Calm now. That's always been your problem. You never realized that I was never playing your game." She turned back to the audience. "Our marriage was a contract, an exchange. He got the image of a loyal wife, and I got protection, though not in the way most people would imagine." She exhaled slowly. "I stayed with Richard because I had a son to protect. Matthew, my son with David. I did everything in my power to shield him, not just from the truth, but from the ugliness that surrounded it." The guests looked toward the back of the room where a tall young man stood silently. Strong jawline, piercing blue eyes. He looked nothing like Richard, but every inch of him bore the quiet strength of a man raised in truth, even if that truth had remained hidden. Helen continued, "What Richard never knew was that my father, who saw through his charming exterior early on, took steps to protect our family legacy. He placed all our assets into a trust." She let the words settle. A trust that could only be accessed by Matthew, not Richard, not even me. Richard's eyes widened. "Yes, I stayed, but not because I was weak or trapped. I stayed because the only thing more dangerous than silence was leaving before the time was right." The crowd was silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on them like fog. "For 40 years, Richard tried to manipulate me. He tried to charm lawyers, bully accountants, even tried to pit me against my own family, all of it to get to that trust." Helen looked at him now, not with fear, but with a strange kind of pity. "And the whole time he never realized the walls he built around me were the same ones that kept him out." She stepped back from the mic, and tonight they finally crumbled. Richard lunged forward, face flushed with rage, but 2 unformed officers near the ballroom doors moved swiftly, stepping in before he could reach the microphone. The guests recoiled in their seats as the officers held him back with firm, practiced hands. "You think you can rewrite history?" Richard spat. You think anyone will believe this circus of yours? Helen didn't even blink. No, Richard, she replied, voice calm. I don't need to rewrite anything. I'm just finally telling the truth. She turned to Eleanor, whose hands were still trembling. With a nod of reassurance, Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed, creased, and clearly handled with care over the years. She handed it to one of the officers. He wrote this, Eleanor said softly. A letter? The night after David died, he confessed. I kept it in case Margaret ever needed it. The officer examined it, nodded, and passed it along to his partner. The murmurs in the room grew louder, disbelief giving way to indignation. Helen faced the audience again. You all saw Richard as a successful businessman, a devoted husband, a pillar of this community. But he was never any of those things. He was a man who used fear, silence, and manipulation to get what he wanted. Then she gestured to the back of the room. Matthew stepped forward. I've known the truth for over a decade, he said, voice steady. My mom told me everything when I was ready to hear it. About my father, about the accident, about Richard. He paused, eyes scanning the stunned faces in the room. We chose this night, this moment, because it was time. Time to end the lie. Time to stop pretending. He turned toward Richard. You took everything from my father, but you will never take this family's peace again. The officers began reading Richard his rights. His protests grew weaker. His eyes darted wildly, not toward his wife, not toward his son, but toward the doors, searching for an escape that didn't exist anymore. Helen stepped forward once more. This isn't revenge, she said. This is restoration. This is what it looks like when the truth finally breathes. And as Richard was led toward the exit, the room erupted not in applause, but in stunned silence. A silence that carried both the end of an era and the beginning of something new. The ballroom had never been so quiet. Even with Richard gone, escorted out through the front doors by police, the weight of what had just unfolded still pressed heavy on every guest's shoulders. Some sat back, stunned. Others leaned forward, sensing there was more because Helen hadn't stepped down from the stage. She looked at Matthew, who stood calmly at her side, then at Eleanor, who had returned to her seat, but still gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. I told you this story wasn't over, Helen said, her voice softer now. There's one final piece, something I've never shared, not with anyone, not even Matthew. She reached into her clutch and pulled out an aged folded letter sealed with brittle wax. This, she said, holding it up, was given to me by David the night before he died. A collective intake of breath rippled across the room. He told me not to open it unless I ever needed the strength to fight back. I never had the courage until now. Helen carefully peeled open the letter, her hands steady despite the tremble in her chest. She began to read aloud, her voice growing quiet and intimate, drawing the room in like a secret being whispered to every heart present. My dearest Helen, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I've uncovered something about Richard. He's not just in debt. He's involved in something criminal. He's using your father's factory to move money for dangerous people. I confronted him. He didn't deny it. And I'm scared. If anything happens to me, know this. It wasn't an accident. There's a ledger. I've hidden it in the old storage room behind the third panel on the left wall. It documents everything. Dates, names, transactions. Use it, Helen. Use it to protect our child. And if someday you find love again, don't hold back. Take it. I want you to be free. Love always. David. Helen's hands lowered, but her voice didn't break. I found that ledger years later, she said, and I kept it hidden until I knew justice was possible. She nodded toward the far corner of the room where an officer approached with a thick, leather-bound book. He handed it to Matthew, who opened it, revealing page after page of names and dates. This isn't just about my father's murder, Matthew said. It's about exposing a network built on lies. And the room, once breathless, now began to buzz again, with a new understanding of just how deep Richard's deception had gone. Matthew held the ledger high for a moment, letting the room see its weight, not just in pages, but in consequences. His voice rang out with calm certainty. This book contains records going back 25 years, wire transfers, fake contracts, names of shell companies. It's all here, and every trail leads back to Richard Whitmore. The guests shifted in their seats, the enormity of what they were witnessing settling in like a fog. Some looked visibly shaken. A few wiped tears. One older man whispered, "My God, he sponsored our charity gala last year." Helen stood beside her son, the two of them framed in light from the chandelier above. No longer just a mother and child, but survivors, protectors, witnesses of truth. "This ledger is already in the hands of investigators," Helen added. "Tonight was only the beginning. The authorities have what they need." This time he won't walk away. The officer who had delivered the ledger nodded solemnly. "We're moving forward with full prosecution," he confirmed to the audience. "Fraud, money laundering, and now with the letter and the confession, manslaughter charges may reopen." Helen took a deep breath. "For years, I lived in a house where silence was survival, where appearances mattered more than reality. I smiled in holiday cards. I hosted dinners. I wore pearls and made small talk while my heart lived in a shadow." Her voice broke just slightly, but she continued. "I stayed, not because I was weak, but because I needed to wait until my son was ready, until Eleanor was safe, until the truth could stand on its own." Matthew reached for her hand, and now it can. The guests rose to their feet slowly at first, then all at once. The applause wasn't loud or celebratory. It was respectful, reverent, the kind of response one gives to someone who has endured in silence and emerged with strength. Helen turned to Eleanor, who stood nearby, tears still on her cheeks. The two sisters embraced tightly 40 years of shared pain, exhaled in one quiet, trembling moment. "And this," Helen said, her voice steady once more, "this is what reclaiming a life looks like, not in rage, not in revenge, but in truth, in dignity, in finally being seen." The applause swelled, and the ballroom, once heavy with secrets, now stood lit by something else entirely: resolution. The ballroom lights softened as Helen stepped forward once more, her voice calm, but charged with the weight of everything she had carried. "For so long, I thought staying silent was strength. That protecting Matthew meant never speaking David's name. That surviving quietly was the only way to win." She looked at her son with tearful pride. "But I realize now that survival is not the same as living, and silence isn't strength when it protects the wrong people." Helen reached into her clutch again, lifting the final page of David's letter. "There's one last line," she said, "a postscript I've read 1,000 times but never aloud." She unfolded the worn page, her eyes glistening. "If you ever find love again, take it. Don't let my memory chain you to sorrow. I'd want you to be free." Helen closed the letter gently. "For years, I thought that meant staying with Richard, that honoring David meant sacrificing everything else. But now I understand." She looked at the audience, many of them crying, holding hands, leaning on each other in quiet solidarity. "It means letting go. It means choosing joy. It means knowing I did the best I could and forgiving myself for not leaving sooner." Eleanor stepped beside her, her hand on Helen's shoulder. "You were never alone," she said softly. "You just didn't know how much we all needed the truth, too." Matthew joined them, tall and steady. Tonight wasn't just for us, it was for David, for every person silenced by fear, for every woman who thought endurance was her only power. Helen turned back to the crowd. "To anyone listening tonight, don't wait 40 years to speak your truth. I don't believe that love means losing yourself, and don't ever let anyone tell you that your silence is noble." She paused, voice breaking just slightly. "You're allowed to want peace. You're allowed to want more. And you're allowed to start again." The guest rose in a final wave of applause, louder this time. Not just respectful, but full of admiration, full of emotion, full of release. As the music returned soft and low, Helen walked off the stage between Ella Lennar and Matthew. The guests parted, making way for them. The screen faded to black, and white text appeared. Justice served, love remembered, legacy restored, and just as the music began to swell, a faint sound rang out, a phone buzzing on a nearby table. A subtle hint, a new beginning waiting quietly in the wings. If this story touched your heart, share it. Speak your truth and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, clarity, and quiet strength.